what is the domain of the function f of x equals 5 over the quantity x minus 3 times x plus 1? All right, so this here is what we call a rational function. It's a rational function because it's a fraction, right? We have something on the numerator, something on the denominator. So what is it asking us when we want to find the domain? Remember, the domain represents all x values that we can plug in and actually get an answer. Okay, and we also have to remember, right, with rational functions or even rational numbers, right, what is the main thing to remember? Right? We cannot have a 0 in the denominator. Right? We cannot have 0 in the denominator. Now remember, that doesn't necessarily mean that x cannot be 0, right? So what do we have to do here? We have to find the value of x so that when we plug it in, we actually get 0 in the denominator. And then that number is not going to be in our domain. Now, this is already factored out for us, right? So we actually have two different factors here. So what does that tell us, right? Let's think about this, okay? Let's say I ask you to find f of 3. Okay? So what you'll probably do is, okay, I'll plug into 3, right? I'll get 3 minus 3 times 3 plus 1. And this part actually doesn't really matter, right? But notice what happens. Oh, wait a minute. I get a 0 times 4, which is just still equal to 5 over 0, right? So what does that mean? It means that when we plug in the 3 into the function, we end up with a 0 in the denominator. So that means that 3, right, is not in our domain, right? We cannot evaluate f of 3 because f of 3 does not exist. Okay? So by using that same sort of method here, right? Remember, the key is these are already factored, which makes the problem a little bit simpler, right? What if we want to find f of, in this case, I'll pick -1, right? So hopefully you understand why I picked these two numbers, right? But let's check it out, right? Okay, I get 5 over -1 minus 3 times -1 plus 1. Right? Do the correct order of operations here. So I get -4 times 0, which still gives us 5 over 0, right? Which does not exist. So what does that tell us? It tells us that 3 is not in our domain, and also -1 is not in our domain. Okay? And just by looking at this function, we can see that there are no other values of x, right, that we can exclude, right? So what we mean by that is any other number we pick, right? Any other number we pick, we can plug it in here, and we can feed it into the function, into the machine, and we should get an answer, right? These are the only two values where we will not get an answer. So the domain then should be all real values or all real numbers except -1 and 3. Now, how do we write that in interval notation, though? Okay. So remember, it's all numbers except -1 and 3. So I'm going to put -infinity, and then we keep going all the way up to -1. And then we go from -1 to 3, and then we go from 3 to infinity, right? So this is the way to write the domain when we're just excluding values, right? So notice from -infinity to infinity, but what are we excluding? -1. That's why you put the parentheses around here, right? And then we're also excluding 3. So this should be the final answer in interval notation.